The official English translation says, "Within the earth there was fire." But honestly, that feels pretty different from the original Japanese. So let's take a closer look at what the Japanese actually says. Chi ni hono ari. Now here's a little quiz. Which of these do you think is the most accurate translation? There was fire on the land. The planet was engulfed in flames. There was fire in the world beneath the surface. The truth is, in Japanese, just changing the phrasing slightly can make things really ambiguous. So none of these are technically wrong. They all work in their own way. And here's something else to keep in mind. In the English version, both Harley's god and the Shandian god are translated as Earth God, but in the Japanese version, they're described differently, using different wording. So when you compare the English and Japanese side by side, you'll start to notice that a lot of the original nuance gets lost in translation. A few interpretations of Harley's Japanese lines started to spread, but a lot of them seemed like they were heavily relying on ChatGPT. And because of that, many of them missed the subtlety and nuance of the Japanese wording. Even the official sources have made critical mistakes, such as referring to Garling as the King of God Valley. So today, we're finally diving into a full breakdown of Harley's lines from the perspective of a native Japanese speaker. In the first half of this video, I'll walk you through how these lines work in Japanese, how Oda-sensei intentionally chose words that leave room for multiple interpretations. And in the second half, I'll share my own personal theory. It actually led me to a pretty surprising conclusion. If you're interested in a deeper breakdown of Harley's Japanese lines, I've got a full explanation available on my page as well. Now, just from the single character chi, it's actually hard to pin down exactly what it means. It could refer to daichi, which means the land or the ground we stand on. In that case, it's simply talking about solid land. But the same character is also used in Chikyu, which means the planet Earth, so it might be referring to the whole planet itself. Or it could even mean Chite, the underground world beneath the surface. So, based on that, the phrase could mean one of three main things. There was fire on the land. The planet was wrapped in flames. There was fire deep underground. But the word fire isn't always just literal. Sometimes, especially in this kind of context, it represents something deeper, like will or spirit. For example, when Roger died and triggered the Great Pirate Era, Rayleigh described it by saying, "He turned it into a blazing fire." And then there's Sabo, who spoke of the Mera Mera no Mi flames as if they carried Ace's will. We also saw the five elders ask Imu about a certain light that must be extinguished, suggesting someone whose presence or spirit still burns. Now, about the word Ari, which means there is or there exists. People often say it sounds like an old-fashioned word, but it's not strictly classical Japanese. It's still used in formal or literary writing even today. The subject here is hito, meaning person or people, but in Japanese, that can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. It might refer to a specific individual, a group of people, or even humanity as a whole. In Japanese, concepts like singular versus plural, or even male versus female, aren't as important as they are in some other languages. For example, think of that famous line from Luffy, "People die." That could be taken as referring to the people of Alabasta, or it could be speaking more broadly about the human species in general. That kind of flexibility allows Japanese manga artists to leave things open on purpose. They can keep characters or meanings vague, using the language's ambiguity to create mystery or build tension. Oh, and by the way, if you're curious about the Japanese language, the owner of this channel also offers Japanese lessons. Check the description for more details if you're interested. Now let's talk about desire. The word yokubo simply means desire or craving. It's actually the name of one of Vegapunk's satellites, York, who represents desire itself. It's well known that Lilith's line, "Can't we control the desires of living creatures?" was actually a subtle hint at York's betrayal. And when York finally did turn on them, Vegapunk regretted it deeply, saying, "Maybe we never should have tried to separate desire from humanity." As a scientist, Vegapunk clearly has a strong thirst for knowledge too, and that kind of curiosity, wanting to understand the unknown, is something that might have existed even in the first world. It's entirely possible that someone back then, just like Vegapunk, gave in to their thirst for knowledge and ended up touching something forbidden, like the sun. Let's break this down. The phrase Kinda no Taiyo literally means the forbidden sun, a sun that's off limits, something you're not supposed to touch or use. It's the same wording that's used in Japanese translations of the forbidden fruit from the story of Adam and Eve. While the exact reason isn't clear, in this context, it seems the sun was something the people of the first world were never meant to mess with. So, what exactly is this sun referring to? In the world of One Piece, the sun shows up in a few different ways. First, there's the most obvious one, the same kind of sun we have in our own world, shining in the sky. But here's the interesting part. Characters like fishmen and mermaids, who have never seen the real sun with their own eyes, refer to it using katakana. That's a common manga technique used when a character doesn't fully understand a word. They're just repeating the sound without grasping the meaning. There's a great example of this when Luffy hears the term salt concentration. He has no clue what it means, so he just echoes the sound using katakana. But what's even more fascinating is what Zoro says, because in Japanese, the words enbun, salt content, and enbun, flame cutting, sound exactly the same. He ends up twisting the meaning in his head. He says, "One day I want a sword that can cut through fire, an enbun sword." And later on, he actually learns a technique that splits flames, almost like the words themselves foreshadowed it. And speaking of the sun, there's also the mother flame, the unfinished energy source that Vegapunk managed to make functional. It's often referred to as a kind of sun, too. Vegapunk, unable to suppress his thirst for scientific progress, created the mother flame, a flame that never goes out. He later described this act as getting too close to the sun, using it as a metaphor for overstepping boundaries. Even Lilith once said, "If we had an eternal flame, we could make a sun." So this forbidden sun could mean one of two things. It might literally be the actual sun, or it could be this kind of energy, the kind Vegapunk was reaching for. And now, about the word fureta, which literally means touched. In Japanese, though, the verb fureru can mean more than just physical contact. It's often used to mean reached, came into contact with, or even violated in the sense of breaking a rule. For example, Sengoku once said that the Rock's pirates touched a taboo using the phrase kinki ni fureta. The same verb is also used in phrases like breaking the law. So when we say touched the forbidden sun, it can mean a few things. Someone literally touched a sun-like object. Someone reached a level of technology close to the sun. Or someone knowingly broke a rule and got involved with something forbidden. In this way, Oda Sensei is likely leaving room for interpretation on purpose. The word reijin includes the same kanji that's used in the word dore, which means slave, and according to Who's Who, it was slaves in ancient times who first prayed to the sun god Nika. So in this case, it's safe to assume that reijin probably refers to slaves too. In the world of One Piece, slavery has existed for a very long time. For example, around 900 years ago, before the current world government came to power, the Tontada people were treated like slaves by the Don Quixote family. And although the details aren't fully revealed, Who's Who also hinted that the fishmen have a long history of being enslaved as well. On top of that, there are even stories of slaves from ancient times who cried out for freedom from the sun god Nika. Now, let's talk about the word taiko, or ancient times. In Japanese, this refers to an era that predates the oldest recorded history, so we're talking more than 15,000 years ago, back when people first started living near natural springs and fresh water. Interestingly, the word taiko has only been used a handful of times in One Piece so far. One was in Little Garden, when Vivi mentioned the age of dinosaurs. Another was in Enel's Space Operations, in the mural titled People of the Moon Who Lived in Ancient Times. Putting this together, it's highly likely that the people who lived in the so-called First World had some connection to the Moon people. The hints are subtle, but they keep stacking up. By the way, some people out there are saying that Reijin is just an old-fashioned word for dore, meaning slave. Even if you look it up using ChatGPT, it might give you the impression that it's a commonly used classical term, but actually, even in Japan, it's not a word you see very often. So it's very possible that Oda-sensei chose Reijin not just to mean slave, but to carry some other hidden meaning as well. Now, about the phrase, the sun god has appeared. What's interesting here is that only the term sun god is in quotation marks. If you look at Harley's dialogue, it's the only phrase that gets this kind of treatment. That suggests that the sun god is being highlighted as a central, maybe even heroic figure in the story. And the verb arawareta, has appeared, also matters. This isn't the same as saying someone came, which would be kita in Japanese. Arawareta is used when something or someone shows up suddenly, like they weren't supposed to be there or were thought to be gone. You actually see this same word used when the giant warrior pirates arrived at Egghead. Even though they literally came there, the verb used was arawareta, because the world thought they were gone. So by using arawareta with the sun god, it's saying that this figure appeared out of nowhere, likely in response to people's wishes, hopes, or prayers, almost like a miracle, not just a physical arrival. This character, Chi, is the same one we talked about earlier. The god of the earth grew angry. What's important here is what this god is angry about, something that existed in or on the earth. But here's where it gets interesting. This phrase uses a slightly different form than the one we heard during the Shandian ritual. In that ritual, they said, Daiichi no Kami, the god of the great land, which clearly refers to land or solid ground. However, in Harley's version, it's just chi, which, as mentioned before, can mean different things depending on context. It could be the land, yes, but it could also mean the planet itself, or even the underground world. So the scope here feels much broader. It's not just a god of the surface, it could be a god of something much deeper or more cosmic. Also, if you think back to the Shandia ritual, the god associated with rain seems to be referred to as the god of the sea in Harley's account. That shift suggests that different regions may interpret these gods in their own ways. Their understanding of the same divine forces might vary based on their history, beliefs, or environment. First, let's break down the meaning of go-en. In Japanese, the kanji for fire is a single character. When you put two of them together, it becomes flame or blaze. Now, if you add the character for karma or deed, go, you get goka, which translates to something like karmic fire or hellfire. This word is often used in Buddhism to describe the destructive flames that come from one's own evil deeds. It's also used to refer to the fires of hell that burn and torture sinners. So, when we hear about this serpent of Go-en, it's very possible it's tied to the idea of hell, a snake associated with punishment or damnation. Interestingly, Goka has appeared in One Piece before. Rayleigh used it metaphorically when talking about how Roger's will spread like wildfire. And it's also part of the kanji for Red Rock, the name of one of Luffy's powerful moves. But here's the thing. We don't know for sure if this Serpent of Hellfire is a literal snake engulfed in flames, or if it's symbolic. There's a popular theory that the phrase blood-soaked serpent is a metaphor for the Red Line, the massive red land mass that runs through the world. So in the same way, Serpent of Go-En could also just be a poetic image, maybe representing something red, burning, or cursed, rather than an actual snake made of fire. The world was wrapped in death and darkness. The verb used in this phrase normally means to wrap something up, like with cloth or paper. For example, the bundle Denjiro was holding is called a furoshiki, a traditional wrapping cloth. Because it's used to cover and carry things, the verb tsutsumu is used for that action. So, in this case, the idea is that the entire blue planet was covered or shrouded in death and darkness, like the world itself was wrapped up in it, unable to escape. Up until now, we've been looking at how the Japanese language is used in Harley's lines. But from here, I'd like to share a Dusk style interpretation of what the first world might have been. First, let's establish something important. According to Harley, the world has already been destroyed twice. That means both the first world and the second world were each advanced civilizations in their own time. We already know that about 900 years ago, a highly developed kingdom flourished in the One Piece world. That's most likely what we would call the second world. So by that logic, the first world also had its own advanced scientific technology. The question is, how did that technology evolve? My belief is that the key was the Forbidden Sun. That's what they used. That's what pushed their science forward. And that's probably what led to their downfall. The phrase, humans gave in to desire and reached for the Forbidden Sun, probably refers to people who wanted wealth and power, and so they tapped into what was known as the eternal flame, an unlimited source of energy. By doing that, they laid the foundation for rapid scientific progress. This is likely how the first world became an advanced civilization. And what's really fascinating is that remnants of that technology might still be around, even in Elbaf, like that mysterious facility that seems to hint at lost science. As I mentioned earlier, the idea of desire ties into something Lilith once said. The desires of living things can't be controlled. That really captures the heart of it. Vegapunk, for example, couldn't resist his own thirst for scientific discovery. He ended up creating the Mother Flame, what they call a flame that never goes out. And he later reflected on that, saying he got too close to the sun. That metaphor perfectly echoes the story of the first world. It's like history repeating itself, driven by the same unstoppable desire. However, this raises an important question. How did Vegapunk manage to bring the Mother Flame to a practical, usable state? It's likely that the foundation for it came from the experiments conducted on Arbor. After all, he's able to keep producing flames just by being alive. In contrast, it's believed that the scientists of the first world used flames that naturally existed in the environment. The phrase, "there was fire on the earth," probably means that, on this blue planet, fire originally existed either on the surface or deep underground. We can even see this in the Elbaf mural. It looks as if the very land itself is burning. That fire, I believe, eventually became known as the Forbidden Sun. But it wasn't just ordinary fire. I think it was energy released through nuclear fusion. The sun in our own world shines because of nuclear fusion. It's the process that powers it and lets it release massive amounts of energy. Now here's something interesting. The power plant that Vegapunk uses to generate the mother flame is written using the characters for fusion furnace. That's the same term used for a nuclear fusion reactor. In fact, in real life, fusion reactors are often nicknamed artificial suns or suns on Earth. So it makes perfect sense that Vegapunk would call that energy source the eternal flame, or by its name, Mother Flame. Now, it may have been Vegapunk, the scientist, who first reached for that eternal flame, but it's almost certain that, like Luffy, he had that same kind of personality, the kind that gets excited by the unknown. That makes it feel even more intentional. It's like people driven by strong desires are the ones who end up reaching for the kind of power that can change the world. And maybe that's just the natural law of the universe. That said, the advancement of science and technology doesn't just make life better for people. It also demands a huge amount of labor. What probably happened is this. Once humans got their hands on infinite energy and started gaining wealth from it, they began forming their own societies and even building nations, designed to produce wealth more efficiently. It's possible that the very first king of Alabasta was one of those people. But over time, within that system, certain individuals likely began to be treated like slaves. And as Who's Who explained, those who were enslaved prayed for someone who could free them from their suffering, someone like the sun god, Nika. Now, whether the sun god in the first world was a real, physical person or a manifestation created through the power of a devil fruit, we don't really know. But personally, I believe devil fruits didn't exist until the second world. That's something I want to explore in more detail in another video when we dive into the second world. As for Joy Boy and Luffy, we know they both gained the power of the sun god through devil fruits. But when it comes to the sun god of the first world, I think it's possible that he was a real person. Maybe he's the one the myth was originally based on. What really matters in this phrase is figuring out why the Earth God became angry, and the biggest clue probably comes from the Skypiea arc. Remember what happened 400 years ago in Jaya? When Norland killed the giant snake, a massive earthquake struck afterward. The Shandians interpreted it as divine punishment, a curse from the gods. This shows that people back then saw natural disasters as the work of gods. So if we apply that same logic, the Earth God mentioned in Harley's lines might actually be a metaphor for something like an earthquake, a natural disaster. And we've seen something similar happen recently. After Imu used the Mother Flame to destroy Lulusia, earthquakes started breaking out all over the world. That tells us something. People in the first world probably reached for the Forbidden Sun, advanced their science, and then started developing weapons to strengthen their control. But as a result, just like what happened with Lulusia, they triggered quakes, and people at the time saw that devastation as the wrath of the Earth God. Rayleigh once said something that really stands out here. What we want is the massive treasure left behind by those who called it a weapon. Notice he didn't say Joy Boy created the ancient weapons. He said Joy Boy named them as weapons. That's important. It suggests these so-called weapons may have already existed during the First World. They weren't made during the Void Century. They were inherited. Even when Robin read the poneglyph in Sky Island, she called it the Ancient Weapon Poseidon. She didn't say when or where it was created. But if the poneglyph itself used the phrase Ancient Weapon Poseidon, that means from the perspective of the people who carved it, during the Void Century, these weapons were already ancient. So yes, it's entirely possible that the ancient weapons actually originated in the First World. So what exactly is this Serpent of Hellfire referring to? If you take a look at the mural, there's a figure that looks like a member of the ancient giant race. On his body, there are some unique markings. And interestingly, the snake-like creature on the right side of the mural has those exact same markings. Now, we don't have many confirmed examples of ancient giants, so it's hard to say for sure. But take Oars, for example. His skin is red. So if this snake has the same red color, it's possible that the Serpent of Hellfire is a metaphor for something like Oars, a massive, fiery red being. On top of that, there's another detail. This snake has an X-shaped mark on it, and that instantly brings to mind the island whales. Most of them have scars on their foreheads, just like Laboon. Those scars came from them constantly ramming their heads against the red line. That's actually something explained in One Piece magazine, and if you're curious, I've done a full breakdown of it on my page. Feel free to check it out. I've even made it temporarily available to free members. Now, here's a thought. What if the whale's behavior, headbutting the red line, originated as a way to fight back against this snake? Maybe they used to charge at it over and over again, and that's why the serpent has scars all over its body. And maybe, just maybe, the whales today are still mistaking the red line for that ancient, rampaging serpent, and they're still trying to stop it. And then there's the line. The world was wrapped in death and darkness. I believe that darkness wasn't just metaphorical. It was caused by a natural phenomenon that came about from the sudden leap in scientific advancement. Do you remember that moment in One Piece when the world suddenly went dark? It was broad daylight, and then, in an instant, it was night. That was when the thick Emperor Cumulonimbus appeared, covering everything in darkness. Cricket actually gave a pretty detailed explanation of what it is. He said, "When that thing appears in the sky, it even blocks out light. Day turns into night." And he added something even more fascinating. Some say the Emperor Cumulonimbus is a fossilized cloud, something that's been floating in the sky unchanged for thousands, even tens of thousands of years. Now, we already know the world fell into ruin 800 years ago, but if that cloud really has been floating since long before then, it could date all the way back to the first world. It might have been there since the very beginning. The reason it doesn't disappear like normal clouds is because it's made of two special types, island clouds and sea clouds. Those don't turn into rain. That's why the cloud didn't break down. It stayed in the sky and became part of what we know as Sky Island. So, in this sense, the darkness that wrapped the world could be tied directly to that ancient cloud, an unnatural phenomenon born from science, floating above the world for tens of thousands of years. Most people probably picture Sky Islands looking something like this, but if we go by Cricket's explanation, then this version is actually a lot closer to what Sky Islands are really supposed to look like. That said, this channel has a lot of hardcore One Piece fans watching, so chances are, you probably already knew that. Ever since the very first chapter of One Piece, this type of cumulonimbus-like cloud has appeared frequently. It might just be a lingering trace of the first world. So why did the Emperor Cumulonimbus, those massive clouds, end up covering so much of the world that it was thrown into darkness? Here's why. Both island clouds and sea clouds are made of a substance called pyrobloin, and pyrobloin is actually the same material found in sea stone. It's likely that the people of the first world, using energy drawn from the forbidden sun, began producing materials like pyrobloin, possibly even creating artificial sea stone. Since sea stone is said to be as hard as diamond, it would have been extremely useful for making weapons. We already know that the technology to process sea stone originated in Wano, and in the Udon prison camp where they process it, there's smoke constantly rising from the factory. Interestingly, that same kind of facility is shown in the mural of the Tree of Adam, so here's what I think happened. Factories processing pyrobloin were pumping out so much smoke that it reached the sky and started forming island clouds naturally. As more of these clouds gathered and spread, they eventually formed the Emperor Cumulonimbus, wrapping the entire world in a blanket of darkness. And once the sun's light couldn't reach the ground anymore, plants stopped growing properly. And so, based on this reasoning, I've concluded that the civilization of the first world came to an end in this way. So, that's the general outline of the first world's history as I see it. But before we wrap up, I want to end this video with an interesting connection. We've actually seen that image of smoke rising from a factory, not just in Wano, a winter island shown in one of Caribou's cover stories. It was described as one of Kaido's favorite places. Now, modern-looking factories are extremely rare in the world of One Piece. So, the fact that Oda-sensei included one in a cover story, of all places, makes you wonder, what was the purpose of showing that? Here's where it gets interesting. Let's talk about the One Piece world's calendar. If Norland's era was 400 years ago, that would put Luffy's time at around Sea Circle Calendar 1522, and that means the end of the Void Century happened about 800 years ago, which would place it at Sea Circle Calendar 722. Now go back and look at the cover story numbered 722. It shows an image that almost seems to symbolize the fall of scientific civilization. In other words, it's probably meant to represent the collapse of the Great Kingdom's advanced technology at the end of the Void Century. Now, if the Void Century ended around Sea Circle Calendar 722, then it must have started 100 years before that, so around the year 622. Let's take a look at the cover story from Chapter 622. It's the Bloch world. So the fact that the Elbaf arc begins in a land made of blocks might not just be Oda-sensei playing around with visuals, it could actually carry some deeper meaning. When you hear the word block, the first thing that comes to mind is probably Lego. And Lego is all about expressing creativity, especially from a child's perspective. Oda-sensei has always said that Luffy fights like a kid would think. His attacks and ideas come from pure childlike imagination.